The statistics are grim. 10% of 65-year-olds, 25% of 75-year-olds, and 50% of 85-year-olds will develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And the fastest growing segment of our population is the 85-year-olds. Alzheimer's now is the 7th leading cause of death and the most common form of dementia. Dementia is a brain disease that may affect cognitive function, language, attention, memory, personality, and abstract reasoning. In severe forms, people's memories disappear. They forget their history, they stop talking, and their personality evaporates. A terrifying, progressive, irreversible process. Dementia does not have a good medical treatment except for toxic medications with many side effects that at best may delay entry into a nursing home by a few months. Dementia is a big problem, and it's growing every single day. For so long, we believed that Alzheimer's was a predestined disease, or that a diagnosis was a death sentence. But we now know that this is not necessarily the case. In this episode, experts will discuss myths, prevention methods, and treatment plans for this devastating disease. I promise that if you stay tuned to this episode, you'll leave with a much better understanding of how to protect your brain health. Let's start this episode by talking to Dr. David Perlmutter about the role that our genes play in creating disease. You might be surprised to hear that our genes do not dictate our destiny. We often thought Alzheimer's was just drawing a bad car. You know, your parents got Alzheimer's, you had bad genes, and there are genes that predispose to Alzheimer's. You know, we know that ApoE4, which is a gene that is involved in lipid metabolism, has a big impact and can increase your risk up to 75% if you have a double 4 gene. But what you're saying is that doesn't necessarily predestine you to getting Alzheimer's.
A very good word. It is a predisposition, not a determinant, meaning that while some people have a higher risk for Alzheimer's by virtue of their genetics, that isn't written in stone. There are plenty of people who carry the ApoE4 allele who do just fine cognitively, and there are plenty of people who don't carry it and end up with full-blown Alzheimer's.
Well, you know, there are very few genes that will lead to a specific disorder. So there's been 30-something genes identified that relate to obesity, and if you had all of them, your weight gain would only be 22 pounds, right? There are genes connected to Alzheimer's, but they don't predestine you to Alzheimer's. They are risk genes. Now, there are some that are very strong, like the presenilin genes that are linked to early Alzheimer's when you get into your 50s. That's a different condition. There's later onset Alzheimer's, which is maybe something you might be predisposed to by certain genes like ApoE4, but they're not going to determine that you get it 100%. And that's the good news, because we know now that you can't change your genes, but you can change your gene expression. You can change which genes are turned on or off and how they affect health or disease. And so the way we do that is what we call the exposome. The exposome is the sum total of things we're exposed to, primarily our diet, exercise, sleep, stress, environmental toxins, our gut flora. These are the things that are influencing our gene expression and turning them on or off, turning them up or down every single day, literally minute by minute. So we have tremendous capacity to change from being predetermined, which many of us think we are, to our being predestined to get something, to actually being able to actually change that and actually not have to get those conditions.
I think genetics are important. I probably am at significantly increased risk for that disease by virtue of the fact that my own father died of Alzheimer's. So we really have to get the word out that we may be able to cut our risk in half by gaining aerobic exercise on a daily basis, that not becoming a type 2 diabetic may also cut our risk in half. And I think it's critical that these words get out because no one is talking about it. When you watch television in the evening, the news, all you see are advertisements for Alzheimer's drugs that do not work. So I think the message is to embrace the notion of preventive medicine as it relates to the brain, and that's the message everyone has to get.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we've done so much research, billions and billions of dollars of research on Alzheimer's, over 400 published studies on reversal trials on drugs, and 99.6% of them don't work. And the ones that work delay the progression of Alzheimer's such that you'll spend 3 months more at home before you go to the nursing home. And,
That's right.
and so what you're suggesting is that this is not inevitable, that there's actually a possibility of stopping or preventing the course.
And the cynic in me, and I'll admit it, is that this is the dirty little secret that shouldn't get out. Because what has to happen is a miracle drug needs to be developed so that it can be monetized. That's how the system works. And the idea that our lifestyle choices, which don't cost anything, can prevent the very disease that's costing us in this country $230 billion a year, that message can't get out.
It reminded me of a story from Dale Bredesen, who told me that he got funding for $2 million to do research on Alzheimer's by using multiple approaches: diet, exercise, sleep, nutritional supplements, things that help support health. And he was told by the Institutional Review Board that reviews the safety and efficacy of studies that it wasn't okay to use all these interventions, because how would you know what worked, and was it safe to actually eat better, exercise, sleep, deal with stress reduction, and take a bunch of supplements? And I'm like, this is ridiculous.
It's the type of medicine that you and I have been practicing for years and years. And when our Alzheimer's patients stabilize or actually improve, and they want to know, well, which part of the program do you think is doing it? And I tell them, I don't care.
Right.
It doesn't matter to me. We're only interested in the result. And unfortunately, that's not how science in the Western world works. We want to know what is that variable, what is that factor, because then it can be monetized.
I became interested in the brain when I was a college student and read a book called Machinery of the Brain by Dean Wooldridge, and I got very excited about the brain and how it worked, and began to be interested in the neuroscience of the brain. How does it actually work? What actually goes wrong? And so I went to medical school and trained in neurology. And in neurology, there are a lot of diseases that we can't do much about, and in particular, the neurodegenerative diseases: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lewy body, frontotemporal dementia, PSP, on and on, where we have not been successful. And you could argue that it's the area of greatest biomedical failure. For the successes that we've had in HIV and the successes that we've had in cancer, we've not had successes in neurodegeneration. So I went back to the lab then after clinical training so that we could understand what are the mechanisms that actually drive these diseases. Why do you get neurodegeneration? And over the years, with the collection of information, we began to see a pattern for what Alzheimer's disease actually is, why you have specific molecules involved, why they actually feed into a specific set of pathways. And we realized that Alzheimer's disease is really about a critical balance that has many, many different inputs to it, dozens and dozens of inputs, not from what we can see thousands and thousands, but many, many inputs that we had to address. And so what happened was, when we started to look at what are actually the things, and we tell the patients, so imagine 36 holes in a roof, you can cover one hole, it doesn't really help you that much. So we want to be able to address all of the different holes. And when we started doing that, we realized it actually fits in very nicely with what functional medicine has been doing in terms of approaches to many different things.
Scientists now call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. What's the link between Alzheimer's and diabetes? Well, new research shows that insulin resistance is now one of the major factors that starts the brain damage cascade, which robs the memory of over half of people heading into their 80s, leading to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Here's the bad news, good news. Eating sugar and refined carbs can cause pre-dementia and also dementia. But cutting out the sugar and refined carbs and adding lots of good fats can prevent and even reverse pre-dementia and early dementia. More recent studies show that people with type 2 diabetes have a 4-fold risk of developing Alzheimer's. That's 400% increased risk. People with prediabetes or metabolic syndrome have an increased risk of having pre-dementia or mild cognitive impairment. You don't have to have full-blown type 2 diabetes to develop brain damage and memory loss from high insulin levels and insulin resistance.
The type 3 diabetes hypothesis, I think, is really compelling, and when you look at the research now that's coming out by the day showing the link between our diets and our lifestyles and our brain health, it seems to be a really strong hypothesis. So there are really interesting associations made between blood sugar and brain health. Depending on the marker of brain health that we use, there have been associations made between even slight elevations of blood sugar, both fasting blood sugar and a marker called the A1C, the hemoglobin A1C, which is basically a 3-month average of your blood sugar, and brain shrinkage. The higher your blood sugar, the smaller your brain. And what hasn't really been known up until, I think, recently is the direction of causality. Do we have smaller brains and that causes us to, reach out for more sugary foods? Do more sugary foods actually shrink our brains? But there's a lot of research, a lot of science really tying various dietary patterns that are higher in fat to better brain health. The Mediterranean diet, for one, is a dietary pattern that's inherently higher in fat. It's rich in extra virgin olive oil and fatty cuts of meat, fatty fish, things like that. And they tend to have significantly reduced risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and also cardiovascular disease. There have been randomized control trials, which is hard data, showing that when you consume more fat in the form of nuts or extra virgin olive oil, it actually leads to improved brain health outcomes in terms of cognitive function. Cognitive function is improved and things like that. Trying to figure out this direction of causality and, does having higher blood sugar make our brains work less efficiently? There have been very large trials which have shown that by improving metabolic health, we can actually significantly delay cognitive decline. So, when we talk about improving metabolic health, this is a really complex topic, but the best way that you can improve your metabolic health is, without question, avoiding sugar and avoiding processed carbohydrates.
You mentioned sugar, and you mentioned sugar in the brain. We talked about Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes, and it's such a manifest problem in this country, with the average person having 22 teaspoons of sugar, where the American Heart Association says eat 6. And for some it's much more, including children. We eat 152 pounds of sugar and 146 pounds of flour. That's a pound of sugar and flour a day for every man, woman, and child in America. So how is this impacting the brain, and what should we do about it? And also I want you to touch on the title of your book, which is Grain Brain, and are grains included in this, or is it just sugar? And should we be eating any grains?
Well, there are a lot of questions there. I'd say,
Yes,
first of all, there are some grains that I think are not necessarily threatening. And I think that if you can find a non-GMO corn, or you want to eat some quinoa, which by definition is not necessarily a grain, but everybody talks about it as if it were. The issues with grain are twofold. It's their carb content and the fact that they contain gluten, in my opinion. There are other issues as well. We know that wheat is, although it is not genetically modified in America, is still sprayed with an herbicide called glyphosate, which is powerfully threatening to the gut bacteria, as the work of Dr. Stephanie Seneff has made very clear to us.
Roundup.
Roundup, you got it. And that's a powerful threat to the microbiome. It has insinuated itself into so many foods. It is the largest global herbicide in terms of its use, 1.35 million metric tons being sprayed on our food and animals' food around the globe, threatening the soil microbiome, threatening the microbiome in you and me, and it needs to stop. The World Health Organization has characterized glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, as a probable human carcinogen that was published in the well-respected journal, The Lancet. And, as it gets to sugar, you're right. And I want to just take a step back a little bit on sugar, because as we've learned from one of our mentors, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, food is information. And it means that the foods we eat are changing the expression of our DNA. That's a heady notion. But the food we eat changes moment to moment the expression of our DNA. Our DNA has been honed to make us the best we can be over a couple of million years, to make us the most able to respond to changing environments, smartest, or some might argue these days how smart we really are. The point is, though, we have this wonderful relationship with our genome, with our DNA. When I say we get our 23,000 or 22,000, 23,000 genes from our parents, yeah, but who did they get it from? It's been passed down generation to generation. Food is information. Suddenly, 200 years ago, we developed the technology to overwhelm this information paradigm with sugar. So we're now sending signals to our DNA, the likes of which it has never seen, and our genome is freaking out, doesn't know what to do with the signal that's coming into the body. There are many things we can talk about: diabetes, glycation of protein, leakiness of the bowel, inflammation with reference to sugar, but I think it's good to every once in a while take a step back to look at the genetics of what this has done to us. We know that diets higher in sugar enhance that very process that we've got to do everything to avoid, and that is inflammation.
Yeah.
So you're right, the statistics on what we're doing in terms of sugar consumption are overwhelming, and what so many people don't recognize is that they're consuming sugar, though they don't spoon it out into their food, but yet, the glass of orange juice, the 12-ounce glass of orange juice is 9 teaspoons right there that you didn't even add in. And that's before the croissant or whatever wonderfully, languaged something arrives that it's okay because it's a croissant, it's from France, it's got to be good for me, or the bagel, you name it. More sugar, more carbs. And the problem is that we're in this mindset that that fat was what we should have eaten, but we stopped the fat in favor of the sugar, and it has amplified diabetes, cancer, heart disease, you name it. The good news is that through books like the ones you've written, that fat has been really validated as an integral part of our diet, and it's the sugar, it's been the sugar, like Gary Taubes and Robert Lustig have talked about, and Mark Hyman, it's the sugar. And,
it's the sugar stupid, right?
Old habits die hard.
Yeah.
We have a sweet tooth. It's a survival mechanism. We love our sugar. There's no one who's going to watch this who doesn't like sugar. I would eat sugar if it wouldn't be harmful. So what did we do? We said, well, sugar's bad, I'll take the diet drink. And now we look at the data I talked about on the diet sodas, and we're digging the hole even deeper.
So the flip side of this, of the sugar being a driver of a lot of the health issues, including Alzheimer's, including depression, including ADD, autism, all through the ways that we described. The flip side of that is fat has been exonerated. Yes. And you wrote a lot about that in your book, and even saturated fat, which still is demonized. And I think that you talk in your book about ketogenic diets as a strategy for brain health, and we see this being used in Alzheimer's and epilepsy and brain cancer. But don't think too much insulin affects only older folks' memories. It doesn't just suddenly occur once you're older. Dementia actually begins when you're younger and takes decades to develop and worsen.
Some early warning signs of Alzheimer's and dementia are like forgetfulness, like when you're in an interview and you're on the spot and you don't remember the question that you practiced 30 minutes ago. And when you walk into a room and you're like, why did I come into this room for? Or where are my keys? Or even things like just a slowing of overall processing speed, like your thoughts aren't as sharp or clear like they used to be, or even your movements, your reaction time. So you might have issues with balance or coordination. And so these are all very significant because they're early warning signs for potential neurodegeneration, things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And one of my missions is to share with the world why the brain is so important and relevant to everyone, is that it allows us to think. It allows us to feel, to move, to have dreams, and to create. And so if that's not working well, you can experience things like forgetfulness. You could experience things like having brain fog, or you're just not feeling sharp. And it's like really subjective, so it's hard. And you might go, if it gets bad enough, you might go to a doctor, or they run all the tests and everything's normal, and they're just like, it's in your head, right? But they were right. It actually is in their head, but not in the sense that they thought. Because it's specific neural networks, specific areas of the brain that if they're not as strong as they were maybe 5, 10 years prior for you, then you can experience those symptoms.
A lot of people consider millennials the caregivers on deck, and that is why millennials should be interested in this topic. But I see millennials as patients on deck, because I know, based on my research, that changes begin in the brain decades before the first symptom of memory loss. 20 to 30 years by some estimates, and even longer by others. So, to me, this is what will ultimately manifest as the clinical presentation of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, really is a sort of lifelong cascade of events that builds up in the brain. And to me, it's something that young people really should be conscious of their whole lives. The same way that we want to do certain things so that we look better come summertime and we're at the beach in our bathing suits.
Cognitive decline and memory loss can be prevented and even reversed. We simply have to optimize brain function, and then we can see miracles. I've seen this happen many times in my medical practice. I first began to realize that dementia was not a fixed problem when I had a patient come in to me named Bud. And Bud was about 70 years old. He ran a large corporation of his own family business, and his wife said he was increasingly dysfunctional. He had to stop working. He was highly depressed. He couldn't remember anything. And he was told he had dementia and was on a slippery slope to death, and that he should get his affairs in order. And I said, well, maybe there's something else going on. And it was really the first case I'd seen. And I said, well, let me just try some of the principles based on the theory of how the body actually works. So we started looking for problems. First, he had prediabetes, which no one had diagnosed. And we know sugar and prediabetes are linked to dementia. If you're diabetic, you have 4 times the risk of getting dementia. We also found out he had high levels of mercury. He lived in Pittsburgh, which is a terrible place to live because they coat the streets with coal ash, they fertilize the fields with coal ash, and they have all the residue from the steel plants in the environment, which produced all this mercury. And we also found out he had a number of genetic issues that affected his brain, leading to less likelihood of getting rid of mercury, higher risk of B vitamin issues, we call methylation problems. He also had problems with glutathione, which is detoxification hormones. And he also had terrible gut issues. For 30 years, his gut was not working properly and had severe irritable bowel. And so we addressed all these factors, not just one thing. We addressed his nutrition and his sugar in his diet. We made sure he had adequate levels of B vitamins. We made sure we got rid of the mercury in his body by getting rid of his fillings and getting the mercury out of his system through chelation and IV therapy. We also gave him treatment for his gut and got his gut functioning again. So all these things were dynamically interacting, and we corrected all of them. And it was like Rip Van Winkle. He came back to work, he was functional, he was happy, he had his memory back. It wasn't 100%, but he was really back into a normal functioning life, and you wouldn't know anything if you talked to him. So that case inspired me to really ask the questions of, if that's true for one person, could it be true for more? And what else could we learn about this pathway that people go on towards dementia without actually having to give them all these drugs? And what's really frightening is that we've spent billions of dollars, over 400 studies on dementia, and really none of them have worked. A couple have had some slight benefit, but what I mean benefit is, they delayed their going into a nursing home by 3 to 6 months, which is not really a benefit. So we have to completely rethink our approach, and that's what's exciting about what we're doing in Cleveland Clinic, what people like Dale Bredesen are doing in reversing dementia. So all these things are really key, and what we're doing here at the Ultra Wellness Center to reverse chronic disease, including dementia. The underlying causes of Alzheimer's disease begin with too much sugar on the brain. The cycle starts when we overconsume sugar and starch and don't eat enough good fat, which leads to insulin resistance or prediabetes. This is what I call diabesity. Diabesity leads to inflammation, which creates a vicious cycle that wreaks havoc on your brain. If you looked at an autopsy of a brain of a patient with Alzheimer's, you'd see a brain on fire. This inflammation occurs over and over again in every chronic disease and very dramatically with the aging brain and the overall aging process.
Carbohydrates are really important. They're essential to life, but we call them, I want you to eat smart carbs. So these are carbs that are loaded with nutrients and fiber, but low glycemic carbs, which means carbs that don't raise your blood sugar, because high blood sugar levels are a terrible predictor of premature aging and Alzheimer's disease. And so think colorful carbs, berries, and red bell peppers, orange bell peppers, carrots, and kill the sugar before the sugar kills you.
The reality is, we did not evolve as human beings to have a high simple carbohydrate diet, but we are awash in simple carbohydrates now. So there may be a number of links between leaky gut and Alzheimer's, but an obvious one is that with leaky gut, you produce a state of chronic inflammation. And inflammation, unquestionably, is pro-Alzheimer's. For example, just the activation of NF-kappa B, one of the inflammatory mediators, some of the genes that this affects turn out to be the very ones that cleave the amyloid precursor protein to produce the amyloid. So you are putting yourself in a pro-Alzheimer's state if you have chronic inflammation. And leaky gut is a great way to produce chronic inflammation. In addition, of course, you end up with fragments of bacteria that actually end up in the brain. You can see them sticking literally at the site of the amyloid plaques.
I have been working for the last year and a half or so with something called the Bredesen Protocol for Reversal of Cognitive Decline. And that's a very intensive program where we work with people with usually with mild cognitive decline, but we also will work with people with moderately advanced Alzheimer's disease. And it is a very multifactorial project to reverse someone's cognitive decline. But the very first thing on the list, the very first thing that we address is diet. And we want people to have a low insulin and a low blood sugar and a low hemoglobin A1C. All of those things help reverse cognitive decline. Alzheimer's has been called prediabetes of the brain. Certainly if you have diabetes, you're at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. So when your blood sugar is high, it pumps your insulin high. And insulin is inflammatory. And inflammation is a major factor in cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. Also, high blood sugar causes something called glycation, where the proteins throughout your body, including in your brain, are having a sugar molecule added to them. That addition of a sugar molecule to a protein is damaging. That's actual damage to that particular molecule in your brain. If you picture a loaf of bread baking, when the top of the bread turns that darker brown color, that's glycation. That part of the bread is very hard, right? And that's damage, that's glycation. And the more that happens in our brain, the more prone we are to neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's disease.
When I work with patients who are suffering from dementia, I stress that it's important for us to look under the hood to see what dirt and poisons we may find and then clean up the metabolic, immunological, and biochemical mess. Few topics are as politically and scientifically charged, yet have such enormous implications for our health and our economy that we avoid them, such as the impact of heavy metals and mercury in particular on our health. But like nutrition, poisoning with heavy metals such as mercury and other toxins and the importance of detoxification is not something we learn about in medical school. So we have very few tools to address this toxic exposure which is contributing to many of the health epidemics we see in today's world. Once we start looking a little deeper, the effects of toxins are not hard to document. Thankfully though, the human organism has an extraordinary capacity for resiliency, for regeneration, recovery, and renewal. I've seen this over and over, not only in relation to my own mercury toxic brain and its recovery, but also in the recovery of many patients with depression, behavior problems, ADHD, autism, dementia, and Parkinson's disease. So even if you haven't been treated for toxins that you have certainly been exposed to, there is still hope, even in extreme cases. Most toxins are also neurotoxins, and we pretty much ignored their effect, or if we haven't ignored it, we don't do anything about it. We know, for example, that there's been links between various environmental toxins and dementia. We also know very well that environmental toxins are linked to Parkinson's. In fact, conventional doctors all accept this because the data is so strong. We know that farmers have a much higher risk of dementia than the average person because they're exposed to pesticides. We know that if you work in tannery factories that tan leather, also exposed to toxic chemicals. We know that pesticides, all these things are driving brain dysfunction. And so we have to be very serious about identifying these toxins and helping people eliminate these toxins as a treatment, not just saying, oh, well, you've been exposed to toxins, tough luck. I recall a patient who came in with early Parkinson's who was 50 years old, which is very young to get Parkinson's. And when I listened to her history and her story, she grew up in the Bronx and she had cockroaches and rats crawling all over her in her bed every night, and she had a terrible pest phobia. So when she moved to the suburbs in Long Island, she was obsessive about getting the exterminator to come every month, inside and out, spraying her house and her garden. And then she was so terrified, she also had a big vat of chlordane, which is a actually banned pesticide from decades ago, was in her garage for decades. And so she was exposed to very high levels of these pesticides and ended up having Parkinson's, and we were able to treat her by helping her body detoxify. When you actually deal with the root causes and then you optimize the body's function with Parkinson's, people can have dramatic improvements in their well-being. I just talked to a patient today who has Parkinson's, and he was exposed at very young ages to all sorts of pesticides. When he was a kid, they used to have the pesticide trucks spraying the neighborhoods, and the kids would run through the pesticide fog. And he had exposure and occupational exposures and many, many other exposures, and he had Parkinson's. And so we found he had exposures to organophosphate pesticides in his urine. We found DDE, which has been banned for decades from DDT, and still he had these in his system. So we were able to actually treat him, and within a very short time, using saunas and mitochondrial nutrients and things to help him detoxify, within a few days, he said he was very much better. So what we see as aging in our culture is really abnormal aging. It's really preclinical disease or breakdown in the system of the body. So we see people decline as they get older. We see people have memory issues as they get older. But that's not normal aging. And in fact, we now know that you can maintain a healthy cognitive status well into your 90s, 100. I have a friend who had his dad who's 105, is still sharp as a tack and lives by himself. So the body's capable of that. And the question is, why are some people able to do that and others not? It's because of the number of insults and stresses and toxins that we're all exposed to, poor diet. That affects our brain function dramatically. When it comes to dementia specifically, and keep in mind, this is just an example of how all disease works. Many genes have been found to contribute to the condition. Chronic diseases like these are usually multi-gene disorders. No one gene is responsible, but the interaction between many genes, their variations, and the way these genetic variations interact with the environment can put someone at risk for a chronic disease such as dementia. That is why we will never find the gene for Alzheimer's or heart disease or cancer or autism or depression. There isn't one. There are many genes that influence our predisposition to certain systemic imbalances and many others that determine how these systemic imbalances show up in each one of us as a disease. This is the loaded gun each of us lives with, but we don't have to pull the trigger. It's our environmental influences, our diet, our stress levels, toxic exposures, the amount we exercise, etc., that does that for all of us. Even if we're predisposed to certain illnesses, that doesn't mean we are destined to have them. This is the concept of epigenetics. Most people know that you can change your environment to reduce toxins, by eating organic food, filtering your water, avoiding mercury-containing fish and vaccines, avoiding dental fillings with mercury, and much more. But most people don't think you can change your genes. Well, you can. In fact, you influence your genes with every bite of food you eat, every thought you think. So if you were born with genes that make you predisposed to this or that problem, you can work around them. You can help them do a better job and prevent disease or other health problems. You can boost your ability to detoxify by turning on the right genes and turning off the wrong genes. You can help by giving them everything they need to do a good job, such as the right vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. For example, eating 2 cups of kale or cabbage will supercharge your detox system and the genes that control it. Though you may have been dealt a certain genetic hand, it is what you do with that hand that determines the course of your life and your health.
67-year-old woman, one of the wealthiest women in Canada, was at early stages of dementia. Having brain fog, her memory was spotty, her skin was dry, she was having trouble sleeping, all these problems going on. She was very worried. She thought she was basically losing her mind and her life was going away. So she came to see me, I tested her, super high levels of mercury, and I put her on my mercury detox program. Now, the detox program I used with her, and by the way, it's a slow protocol. You can do IV chelation therapy, it goes faster, but some people have side effects from the IVs. So I decided a more safer, more natural approach. So what I did with her was I gave her a gentle drug called DMSA, only 250 milligrams every 3rd night. So not very often, so we wouldn't get a toxicity from the drug. In addition, I gave her 2.5 grams of fiber a day. In this case, it was PGX. I gave her 2.5 grams of fiber twice a day to help improve the absorption of the toxins. And then every day, I had her take N-acetylcysteine, or NAC for short, 500 milligrams. And the reason I gave her NAC is that it increases glutathione production in the body. And the glutathione is our most important antioxidant for protection from toxins and for getting toxins out of the body. I gave her the fiber so it absorbed the toxins that were being dumped from the gut. And I gave her the DMSA because it very effectively binds to mercury and to lead and gets them out of the body both through the urine and through the gut. So what happened? 6 months later, she said, you know, I'm starting to feel better. My brain's starting to work better. 1 year later, she said, wow, I think I can get over this. A year and a half later, her mercury went from 50, which is super high, to 33.5, which is very low. All her symptoms were gone. But it took a year and a half. So people need to realize that when they're being damaged by toxins, it takes time to clean up the mess. First off, you have to get the toxin out. And it takes months to get toxins out of the body. Then all those enzymes that have been poisoned by the toxins, they have to be replaced. It takes months to replace to get new enzymes. Then after that's all done, now the body has to repair the damage. So it takes time.
In functional medicine, we look upstream. You know, what's the cause? So what's the cause of the amyloid? It's not just the genes, because genes can be turned on or off, and genes can be expressed in different ways depending on the inputs of the environment, diet, lifestyle, toxins. So with the amyloid, what is driving the production of all this amyloid in these patients?
And so in the rare cases of early onset familial Alzheimer's, where we found those first 3 genes, that's maybe 1 or 2% of all cases. Mm-hmm. We know that the gene mutations cause the production of a longer version of the amyloid beta protein that's more likely to drive amyloid plaque formation. So it's almost like, you know, picture those old chemistry experiments you did when you get a crystal, when you have liquid and you add something to the liquid and you instantly get a crystallization. Mm-hmm. That's called a nucleating event or a seeding event. You seed the crystal. In the brain, amyloid has to get seeded. And in those rare cases of early onset Alzheimer's, those mutations cause a longer version of that amyloid protein that seeds amyloid more rapidly.
That's like a genetic cause.
That's a genetic cause, and it's 1 or 2% of cases. Yeah. But that's not happening in 98, 99% of cases. So you have to ask, I say based on that, you then have to ask logically, what's seeding, like this, like a crystallization event, right? What's seeding amyloid when you don't have more of that longer form of amyloid protein like they have in the rare early onset genetic cases? And what we figured out over the last 10 years is that pathogenic microbes, bacteria, yeast, viruses, may be doing the seeding of the plaques, where the plaques are actually forming to protect the brain against those microbes.
So what you're saying is really heresy, right?
It's pure heresy.
Heresy,
Yes.
which is one,
Yeah.
that we know that there's a blood-brain barrier that stuff can't
Right.
get through.
Yeah.
Two, we know that the brain is sterile.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And
Tell the brain that.
and three, you're discovering something radical, which is this idea of a microbiome of the brain, and that there's really a trigger, which is this infection in the brain that is subtle, but actually is driving this chronic, long-term process of inflammation. That's really the thing that causes the symptoms of Alzheimer's.
Well, yeah, I mean, in essence, what we figured out is, first of all, the brain is not sterile. If you try to look for bacteria and yeast and viruses, you do find them in the brain. And when it comes to certain viruses, we see more of them in Alzheimer's brain. And we think that might be a major culprit. We used to believe that the brain didn't have a lymphatic system.
Yeah.
Right? Now it does. So everything we believed about the brain, no lymphatic system, wrong. Completely sterile, wrong. Right? And the way the brain accumulates microbes is, you could have the blood-brain barrier integrity go down, so they come in from the blood, and that can happen with age. The blood-brain barrier integrity starts to go downhill. In fact, the gut microbiome is what helps to keep that blood-brain barrier integrity.
Well, there's more heresy, right? How the gut flora is affecting the brain.
The gut flora is protecting the brain through the blood-brain barrier, and it helps stop inflammation.
Yeah.
So more heresy.
If it's the right gut microbiome.
If it's the gut, right, that's right. Yeah. And in fact, in our Alzheimer's mice, where they're getting inflammation downstream of the amyloid, it's a two-way street. You start to see that the gut actually loses the bacteria, like bifida and lactobacillus that you get in yogurt and probiotics. They actually start losing it, so you get this vicious cycle.
The news is you actually can modify your risk by doing something before you get Alzheimer's, and you make a big point of that. We're often dealing with things like after the fact, like you said, like having a heart attack and then treating it, as opposed to going into the prevention. And you said that it takes 20 years before you get Alzheimer's symptoms. Your brain is already starting to deteriorate.
We have to back everything up. So what we used to call treating plaques prevention, because we didn't say you have the disease until you get symptoms. Now we want to back that up and say that treating plaques is treating the disease. If you have too many plaques early on and you're perfectly fine, you start treating those plaques, just like you treat plaques around the heart so you don't have congestive heart failure later on. If you have HIV, you don't wait for AIDS to get rid of HIV. So it's a similar idea. And so now treatment of Alzheimer's is backed up to pre-symptomatic treatment when you see plaques. That's going to be the future. And the FDA needs to play along with us on this. And we're not sure
because of testing or because?
Well, the FDA wants you to use an amyloid drug and make people cognitively better who already have the disease.
Yeah.
And that's like having someone with congestive heart failure
His heart's already
and
failed.
say, make them better with Lipitor.
Right.
All right, you had to use that before.
Yeah.
Or it's like someone has a 2-inch tumor and organ failure, and you say, make them live longer with a tumor suppressor.
Right.
So the FDA has to get that. That's an ongoing dialogue we have to have with them. Because if they make us show that amyloid drugs used 20 years before prevent you from getting to the symptoms, how are we going to do 20, 10, even 5-year trials? Who's going to do that? They would cost tens of billions of dollars,
right.
And by the time they're done, you say to the pharmaceutical company, thanks very much, but now your drug's off patent too. And, thanks for spending $20 billion on this new drug. And it's about to go generic because it took this long. So no one's going to do it.
I mean, you said that 40% of people over 85 have symptoms of dementia.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest, fastest growing segment of our population. And the costs are, $200 and change billion, and it's only getting worse. It's affecting, 50 million people around the world. This is an epidemic.
$1 in $5 already of Medicare or Medicaid goes to Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's more expensive than heart disease and cancer treatment.
Yeah, 71 million baby boomers. Within 5 years, you're looking at $3 out of $5 of Medicare, Medicaid going to Alzheimer's.
One of the things that happens in a neurodegenerative model is people actually don't always develop a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia. They start to have degeneration in local areas of their brain. And then as those areas of the brain degenerate, they tend to lose function. And most people obviously blame that on aging, but it's really neurodegeneration. So the most common sign of brain inflammation is really slowness in function in general. So if we talk about cognitive function or recall or mental focus and concentration, we tend to see it slow down. So one of the things people commonly use is the term brain fog. They just can't find the word that they're speaking of. So inflammation, what it does to the brain and to neurons is that it slows down what's called nerve conductance. So nerve conductance is how fast neurons fire from one neuron to the next. So when a neuron is inflamed, the speed of nerve conductance goes down. And the most common symptom of neuroinflammation, especially in the frontal lobe, is people just have a hard time finding their words, or they feel their brain is slow that day. And then, unfortunately, for some people, that becomes an everyday routine type of event. Now, sometimes we've all, I think, experienced having a sluggish brain. There's days when we're not functioning that day or something. Those are probably days where there's some degree of excess neuroinflammation that's taking place, or something that's impacting brain bioenergetics. So the target site for inflammation isn't really a specific lobe of the brain. There are cells called glial cells. And glial cells, like I said before, they're found throughout the entire brain. And the goal is really to try to dampen the messenger pathways that activate the glial cells. And what the research is really showing is that it's really systemic inflammation, that any inflammation in the body turns on brain inflammation. And for people that have like chronic inflammatory diseases, like if they have irritable bowel syndrome or some type of autoimmune disease, that chronic inflammation releases inflammatory messengers, and they actually turn on brain inflammation. So when you look at brain inflammation, it's really susceptible to anything that triggers an inflammatory response, whether it's chemical exposures, food reactions, an inflammatory disease, blood sugar elevations like diabetes. All those things tend to turn on the inflammatory cascade in the brain.
Remember, genetics load the gun, but the environment, what we eat, what toxins we're exposed to, our lifestyle, is what pulls the trigger. If you're finding this series to be helpful, help us spread the message and continue our mission by sharing this docuseries with your friends and loved ones. You can do this by clicking the link below. You talk in your book about ketogenic diets as a strategy for brain health, and we see this being used in Alzheimer's and epilepsy and brain cancer.
That's right.
Right? So tell us about that flip, and also the kind of extreme version of it, which is eating like 80% fat.
Right. Well, first I'll say that when Grain Brain was written, did I ever take the heat for that, for saying we should be eating less carbs and more fat? I mean, that was back in the ancient times of 2013. And, the Amazon comments, oh, this is a diet that's going to kill you, and I'm not dead yet. Monty Python, not quite dead yet. And so I took my lumps and continued to do so, which is good because, if you're not an outlier, no one's going to say bad things about you. So that's a good thing.
The pioneers have arrows in their back.
Yes. And just the basics of do we choose to power our bodies with fat versus carbohydrates was looked at in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. The study was published by researchers at the Mayo Clinic, and they demonstrated that those individuals who favored a higher fat source for calories for their bodies had about a 44% reduction in risk for dementia, as opposed to about an 86% increased risk for dementia if you chose to go the carb route, eating more healthy carbs and healthy grains that, have, as you say, that's been debunked. Taking it to the extreme, when you really restrict your carbs and sugars and really add in not just dietary fat, but other unique types of fat like coconut oil, or even more effectively, what is called MCT, medium chain triglyceride oil, you ultimately shift your metabolism to a point where your cells begin saying, you know what? I'm not going to be burning sugar all the time because it's not around. We are flex fuel organisms. We can burn other things. We can shift, we can adapt to burning fat, not just dietary fat, but fat that we harvest from our own bellies or wherever we're storing fat. Through the liver, these free fatty acids then are metabolized into what are called ketone bodies. And these ketone bodies are an incredibly efficient powerful fuel.
They're a power fuel.
Power fuel. I better get the .com before you do. The URL, powerfuel.com. But that said, it's a terrific way to power your brain. And pharmaceuticals have known this for a long time, to the extent that they actually developed a powdered product years ago that they were marketing and still market as a way to power the brain and get results in terms of memory. So it turns out that powering your brain with fat is a better way of augmenting brain function, preserving the brain, preventing brain decline. It's been used therapeutically since the late 1920s to treat epilepsy. In 2005, in the journal Neurology, was a powerful article showing incredible improvement in Parkinson's patients by going on what we're describing, a ketogenic, a diet that makes ketones, a ketogenic diet. More powerful than any medication in terms of reducing the rating scale that's used to rate how bad Parkinson's patients are doing.
That's amazing.
Just dietary, and yet all that neurologists do generally is treat the symptoms of Parkinson's. I think there's merit to using those drugs. I write the prescriptions, but you've got to treat the fire, not just the smoke. We do that in Parkinson's by giving things like coenzyme Q10, by giving things like NAC and putting patients on a ketogenic diet. Why? Because it makes sense, but beyond that, it's what the science tells us we should be doing.
Yet it's almost absent from medical care, right? Doctors treat patients with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, never mention diet, never talk about it.
It's true, and I'm not going to curse the darkness, but my mission is to light the flame, and that is for any people who want this information, that's what this is all about. That's why we do these presentations. So for those people who want to learn that there's more out there, I'm here to say there is a lot more out there, and there are a few people who are going through the literature published in the most well-respected peer-reviewed journals. What did I just quote? The Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. What did the New England Journal of Medicine tell us in September of 2013? They made a very simple statement. And here's the study. They took several thousand individuals. They said, hello, how are you? We're going to do 2 tests on you today. We're going to measure your blood sugar, and we're going to measure how well your brain is working. They followed these people for about 7 years. They came back and they only did 1 test. How's your brain working? They did an examination of brain function. Didn't even measure the blood sugar at that examination. And what they found was a dramatic correlation between their original blood sugar and whether or not they became demented. And what they found was really quite startling. And that is that even having a blood sugar of 105,
which is normal.
Which is so-called normal, was dramatically associated with risk for dementia. So you just put the word normal, and these are quotes for those who don't know, in quotes, because we need to challenge that. And that is not go with what is the normal value, but what is optimal. A blood sugar of 100 is not optimal. And yet, go to the doctor, you'll get a pat on the back, or who knows where, but they'll say it's fine, you're in the normal range. For people like you and people like me who are out helping to get better information out, we want optimal range. We want the best information. Blood sugar 85 to 90, for example, that's what you want. You want your A1C not at 6 because you're still not diabetic. You want your A1C at 5.3, 5.4. That's ideal. That's what's associated with brain preservation. And these are things that are based upon sugar versus fat.
A couple years ago, I had an 86-year-old woman who was, she had a diagnosis of dementia and early onset Alzheimer's. Her family members brought her in. She was living with her daughter and her daughter's husband, and they had kind of reached the end of their rope. They went through what most patients with Alzheimer's go through. They have a really expensive battery of tests, and then the doctor says, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. Here's a drug, and by the way, that drug has not been proven to even slow the progression of Alzheimer's, much less reverse it, and good luck. I mean, that's essentially
get your affairs in order.
Yeah, get your affairs in order, and seek out some help for the family members, and that's it. And these people weren't, didn't want to accept that. Understandably, and so they were seeking out other approaches, and they came to see me. And first thing I did was I put her on a ketogenic diet, which is what I often do in patients with neurodegenerative disorders. And she, until that time was eating a pretty standard American diet, a lot of flour and bread. She loved cookies and cakes and things like that. So it was difficult for her to make that transition, but her family, since she was living with her family, they made that easier. And I got a call from her daughter a couple weeks later saying, I don't even this is like my mom used to be. You know, I haven't seen this person in 10 years, and her memory was better. She could actually, her short-term memory improved. She was able to function in a way that she hadn't been able to. She was able to take care of herself. And this was just by doing ketogenic diet. And then we started to add some additional cognitive supports in, some of the things that we talked about earlier, as well as some herbs like ginkgo and bacopa and ashwagandha that increase glutathione levels in the brain and are neuroprotective and actually can reverse amyloid, can actually get rid of some amyloid formation. And then she started to improve further. So she was already fairly far along the progression. She didn't recover completely, but she's still doing well. Years later, she's still doing that program, and she hasn't progressed any further. So
which is unheard of.
Unheard of.
We want people to be at least part of the day in ketosis. And what that means is that your body is burning a lot of fat, right? So we move people from maybe possibly a good diet or a terrible diet to a diet that's high in low-carb vegetables, no grains in general, or very, very low grains, no sugar, low fruit, high in certain kinds of fats, the beneficial fats. What are the beneficial fats? Obviously, olive oil, avocado oil, avocados, high-quality nuts and seeds, even high-quality animal protein in moderate amounts. Chicken, fish, lamb, etc. is an important part of the diet. Eggs. But in most people, we're really increasing the fat content in their diet. We often add something called medium-chain triglycerides, 1 to 2 tablespoons a day, to their diet, because medium-chain triglycerides help them get into and stay in ketosis. Medium-chain triglycerides are absorbed really easily from the gastrointestinal tract into our bodies, and also our mitochondria, which can either burn a molecule of sugar or a molecule of fat, right? They will suck up these medium-chain triglycerides very easily and burn them very efficiently for fuel. So a paleo, high vegetable, high fat, ketogenic diet is where we go with diet. Exercise, people have to exercise every day. I mean, we will accept 6 days a week, but we tell them every day, right? And it's vigorous. They have to do either interval training or some kind of vigorous exercise, and we also highly recommend that they do strength core training so that you don't get injured doing your intensive kind of workout.
Low blood flow, #1 predictor of Alzheimer's disease. So if you have things like hypertension, heart disease, erectile dysfunction, you're not exercising, that's a predictor of trouble. So exercise and ginkgo and vinpocetine, 2 supplements I like a lot, and eating things like beets can be really helpful.
Exercise does really profound things to the brain. And I think one of the secrets of exercise is that it is affecting so many different systems. It affects heart rate and blood flow. It affects oxygen levels. And one of the things that we know that is really key is that it affects the levels of growth factors that are in particular very important parts of the brain. 2 key areas are an area critical for long-term memory called the hippocampus. We know that there's increased growth factors there. And a second key brain area important for focusing and shifting your attention, that is the prefrontal cortex. So there are many different effects, and I have to say that I don't think we understand the full range of all the different physiological changes that happen in our brain with exercise, but that's just a few of them that happens that cause things like changes in neurotransmitter levels that improve your mood, and changes in these growth factors that actually improve the function of both long-term memory as well as attention. One of the most exciting findings in recent neuroscience research is findings showing that if you give rats access to a running wheel, and you can show that they are running significantly more than their brothers and sisters that don't have the running wheel, what happens is you stimulate the birth of brand new brain cells. These are adult rats. So there's, in adults, brand new brain cells being born in the hippocampus, a key area important for long-term memory. In those rats that have access to the running wheel, they not only have more hippocampal brain cells, but they actually learn and remember better than those brothers and sisters that are in the cage with no running wheel. So they are essentially strengthening the function of the hippocampus, which is to allow you to form and retain new long-term memories for facts and events. There's some evidence in humans that this is the case as well. It's actually been demonstrated much more clearly and much more extensively in rodents, but my studies looking at the effects of aerobic exercise in healthy young adults are starting to show the first evidence that recognition memory, that is memory that allows you to say, yes, I've seen you before or I haven't seen you before, is actually significantly improved after 3 months of increased aerobic exercise.
Exercise is one of those things, the body of evidence right now is like so strong that, you know, your average neurologist really should write exercise on a prescription pad before he writes anything else. Exercise is the chief way that we can actually, it's, you know, unlike any drug that's on the market, exercise actually has a disease-modifying ability. It can slow the progression of many of these neurodegenerative diseases that we're talking about. I like to incorporate movement into nearly everything I'm doing. So in general, I like to keep my workouts either low and slow or hard and fast. None of this like middle ground stuff, which doesn't really accomplish anything very well, in my opinion. I like to, you know, just move more and do aerobic exercise throughout the day, whether it's, you know, taking the stairs instead of using the elevator, or biking to work, or, you know, just walking around more. You know, just walking was shown recently in a trial, a randomized control trial, to improve cognitive function and vascular risk factors in people with vascular dementia. So walking is truly medicine. And it's very simple. It's something that we can all do. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm obsessed with high-intensity interval training. So, you know, exercise that really pushes your body to the limits. And that limit is going to be different for me than it is for you. Everybody has a different threshold of what constitutes high intensity. But whatever that means for you, you really want to make sure that you're pushing your body to that threshold. Because when you work out at that level of intensity where, you know, you can really only sustain 20, 30, maybe 40 seconds of exercise, you're literally sending a text message to your genome to adapt, to cause yourselves to adapt and grow stronger. And that's not something that we get with lower intensity exercise. And that, you know, that adaptation, that stress response occurs both in our muscles and in our brains. So, I mean, high intensity exercise is profoundly important.
By the way, these are things that if people take them on early, I think they're very preventative of cognitive impairment. So it's good to know early on if you're an ApoE4 carrier and are at increased risk. So I test every single patient who comes through my door for ApoE4.
We recommend, though, that everybody, just as everyone should get a colonoscopy when they turn 50, everyone should get a cognoscopy when they turn 45 or over. If you're 55, 60, whatever, check out where you stand and see. You can do this with genetic testing, blood testing, functional testing, and if you're already symptomatic, then including imaging in that. But if you're not, you don't necessarily need to include the imaging, but you should know where you stand. And definitely, if you have 1 copy of ApoE4, you have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease over someone who has 0 copies. And if you have 2 copies, of course, that's increased further, and it's very likely that you will develop it during your lifetime. The reality is, Alzheimer's disease should be a rare illness, because if everyone simply checked ahead of time and got on the appropriate program, we would not see such a high incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So we do recommend that anyone, especially people who know that they're ApoE4 positive or have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, get your cognoscopy, get checked out, and get on an appropriate program that will minimize your risk for developing full-blown Alzheimer's disease.
If I were going to be advising just everyone about preventing cognitive decline, or to put it a better way, to optimize your own cognitive function for as long as possible. I would say that it's very important to eat well, to lower your stress. What are all the things that lower stress? Make sure that you have a good support system in your life, have a good social life, get out in the world and do things that you enjoy, and do stress reduction techniques whenever you need to. If you're in a terrible situation at your job, get out of it, if at all possible, right? These are obvious things.
You found all kinds of extraordinary things that are all things that actually help to optimize the brain, heal the brain, renew the brain, and also prevent problems down the road. Could you tell us a little bit about that research?
Yeah, we did a clinical trial where you had 30 people learning to meditate, 30 expert meditators who were teaching them, and then another 30 people who were just staying at the same resort, having fun, but eating the same food. So we had a control for the diet, right? Yeah. And what we found was that the folks who were learning to meditate had changes in the right direction for genes involved with inflammation. We looked at the whole expression of all the genes in the genome and built maps. And they were very different for the meditation group versus the resort group. In both cases, resort was good for you. You saw nice changes in genes involved with inflammation.
So having a vacation is good.
Yeah, so vacation was good, but meditation was much better. So with meditation, you saw changes in like the anti-aging enzyme telomerase that grows the ends of your chromosomes, that keeps your cells dividing longer. There was a 40% increase in telomerase activity in the expert meditators who were meditating intensively all week. There were changes in the genes involved with Alzheimer's and how amyloid protein is cleared from the brain that were also in the right direction. I mean, when I looked at all the data, if I was writing a science fiction novel where you had to write about the future, the effects of meditation, I would not have gone as far as the results we saw.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, you think about it, you said even in the novice meditators, it's not like you have to be in a cave in Tibet for 20 years to see these changes. They happen within days or weeks.
This is 1 week.
1 week.
This is all in 1 week.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Yeah. I think, I found personally that applying it in my practice and in myself, it's just been extraordinary in how it works in the brain and reduces anxiety, helps with sleep, improves mood.
Well, stress plays such a huge... Stress affects your gut microbiome, which then affects your brain, which then affects your gut microbiome. And stress ties into sleep. I mean, you're stressed out, so you can't sleep. And then because you can't sleep, you get stressed. And then because you're stressed, you eat junk food and comfort foods.
Sounds like a prescription for Alzheimer's.
As humans, we're a social species. We're not polar bears. Polar bears just do fine by themselves, but that's not us. The more isolated we are, it's actually one of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. It increases our risk. When we're together, we have to work our brains. It's like, what's she thinking? What am I going to do? There's that dance that goes on. And we also get feedback on how we're doing and whether or not our thoughts are helpful, rational, and so on. But who you're connected to really does matter. The longest longevity study ever done found the health habits of the people you spent time with was as good a predictor as anything else as to how long you would live. And so I always tell people, you want to be healthy? Find the healthiest person you can stand and then spend as much time around him or her as possible. We know that if you have depression in girls, females, it doubles their risk of Alzheimer's disease. So the chronic stress hormones associated with depression, with the negativity, with the sadness, the tearfulness, can actually damage some of the circuits in your brain. If you're a guy and you have depression, you have 4 times the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Some people actually think it's a precursor to dementia. The quality of your thoughts really matter. We did a study here on appreciation. So I scanned a psychologist who was writing a book called The Power of Appreciation. And she focused on what she loved about her life, and her brain looked awesome. And I'm like, well, you have to do the opposite so that we can compare. And so I had her think about what she was afraid of, what was negative in her life. And it completely deactivated her frontal lobes, so the judgment center of her brain, completely deactivated her temporal lobe, which is where Alzheimer's disease starts, and it dropped out her cerebellum, which is the processor in the brain.
Sleep is very important. People need to get 8 hours sleep. If they're not getting good sleep, we need to work very hard to change that. We make sure everyone who comes through our program does not have sleep apnea. Many people who are overweight, of course, have sleep apnea, but the sleep apnea that often gets missed is people who are the skinny sleep apnea people. Central sleep apnea, or just a configuration of their mouth and the back of their throat where they have an upper airway spasm, and unbeknownst to them are having episodes of low oxygen throughout the night. Those people tend to be tired throughout the day, even though they think they're getting plenty of sleep.
Sleep apnea triples the risk of Alzheimer's disease. On scans, it makes you look like, your brain looks like you have Alzheimer's disease, because your brain is the most oxygen-hungry organ in the body.
Attaining an optimal brain is not just about diet either. It's about making sure that you're sleeping well. And I'm not just talking about getting more sleep, but I'm talking about higher quality sleep. You know, we really want to cut down our use of smartphones and technology at night, because the blue light from those devices, whether we perceive blue light or not, tells our brains that it's daytime. You know, our brains are operating on operating system 1.0. And when we're looking at bright light, whether it's, you know, from our TV screens or our smartphones or our laptops, that sends a signal to our brains that it's daytime. And our brains don't want to wind down when it's daytime. Our brains want to forage for food and, you know, procure a safer environment for our tribe. So, you know, making sure that we're sleeping better, I think, is really important, because many of the brain's sort of custodial efforts occur while we're sleeping.
Those are kind of the 4 important lifestyle premises: diet, exercise, stress, and sleep. Then after that, we go into the biomarkers. There's a huge battery of blood testing, urine testing that we do on folks who are coming through this protocol. Lots of inflammatory markers that we look at, infectious markers that we look at. Are they carrying one of the herpes viruses? Are they carrying Lyme disease? Are they carrying the Lyme co-infections? Do they suffer from mold biotoxin illness?
We've all heard a lot about the gut microbiome and its importance in various diseases, but it is true that the rhinocidal microbiome is also critically important. And in fact, the neuropathologists have been telling us for many years that whatever causes this pathology of Alzheimer's disease looks, if you look at the neuropathology of it, looks as if it has come from the nose. It is the rhinencephalon, the nose brain, that is typically affected in this illness. And as they've said over the years, we just don't know what that agent or agents are. Well, the reality is that if you look at what happened with neurosyphilis, and in some ways, Alzheimer's disease is the neurosyphilis of the 21st century. If you look at what happened in neurosyphilis, you had a single organism, Treponema pallidum, which set up a chronic inflammation in the brain for years and years that could lead to dementia, and frequently did. With Alzheimer's, it's different. What we see as Alzheimer's, the amyloid, the tau, the changes that we see in pathology, are the result of a protective response, and that's 180 degrees from what people have claimed. This is a protective response to 3 fundamental different insults, and one of them is infection, chronic infection or inflammation. And so when you look at the brains of Alzheimer's patients, what has been reported? Organisms from the mouth, like P. gingivalis, organisms from the lip like herpes simplex virus 1, and then various fungi and molds that are actually living in your sinus. So in fact, your rhinosinal microbiome is going to turn out to be very important. And some of the work, for example, on looking at biofilms, looking at so-called marcons that actually secrete specific factors that reduce the trophic support to your brain and enhance cognitive decline. This supports the idea that ultimately you want to have an optimized rhinosinal microbiome. Not terribly surprising from what we're seeing with the gut, the oral microbiome, the skin microbiome. These microbiomes are turning out to be critical for complex chronic illnesses like Alzheimer's disease.
All those things need to be looked at, and if they have those, they need to be treated. If they have a high homocysteine, we need to correct that. Their B12 needs to be corrected. Their thyroid needs to be optimized. We don't look at the numbers and say, okay, are they in the so-called normal range on the lab test? No, we have a particular optimal range that we're looking for. Is their vitamin D optimal? Are all their B vitamins in an optimal state? Are all their minerals in an optimal state? Do they have heavy metal toxicity? Do they have a high mercury, a high lead, a high cadmium? If they do, we need to treat that. We need to get rid of it because any of those things can be a cause. It's important to have a lot of detox foods in your diet. So what are detox foods? Well, the cruciferous vegetables are very important detox foods, right? In fact, all vegetables are important in one way or another detox. So as far as volume, when you look at your plate, we want 2/3 of what you put into your body to be a vegetable. We want a variety of colors. We want a variety of types of vegetables, right? We want non-GMO. We want organic as much as possible because pesticides and insecticides are potential toxins, right?
Toxins must be excreted through the body's liver detoxification system. Detoxification happens in 2 phases, both dependent on different sets of enzymes to do the job. As we now know, the effectiveness of these enzymes you produce depends on the genes that have a code for that type of enzyme. It might be hard to imagine, but nature has given us the ability, the remarkable ability, to detoxify compounds which were not around at the time humans evolved, such as medications and environmental toxins. Drugs are metabolized or detoxified by enzymes, which are produced by ancient genes. Some of us are better detoxifiers than others and have an easier time getting rid of drugs or toxins. Environmental factors interact with susceptible genes to trigger this injury in the brain. And at each point of injury, there are things we can do to stop or reverse the process. Free radicals from toxins lead to oxidative stress or rusting, which damages our mitochondria, the cell's energy factory. This leads to the overexcitation of cells and inflammation. Ultimately, all this results in cell death and the symptoms we see as mood disorders, behavior problems, as well as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But we can use antioxidants, we can use energy boosters, and anti-inflammatory treatments along with compounds that reduce the overexcitation or excitotoxicity of the brain cells, which leads to cell death. And we can protect the brain and prevent, stop, or even reverse this process. And maximizing our body's ability to detox from toxic chemicals is an important part of protecting our brains. What we are discussing here is a different approach to disease, and it's called functional medicine. The power of functional medicine has transformed the lives of many, including my friend and colleague, Dr. Terry Walls. Now, you were in a wheelchair, and it was only a one-way street, worse.
As in a wheelchair, I couldn't sit up anymore. I was in a zero-gravity chair where I was fully reclined, knees higher than my nose. I struggled to walk 10 feet using 2 walking sticks. I was losing my keys, my phone. I had the severe MS pain, was having to go to the pain clinic, take frequent MedWell to try and control the pain.
Powerful steroids.
So life was very tough. And that's where I was in 2007. I was still doing my little tiny workouts, like a 10-minute, very simple little stomach curl. If I did 12 minutes, I couldn't function for a day and a half. But I could do 10 minutes and go to work. in 2008, after doing my diet and lifestyle protocol, I was able to do a 20-mile bike ride with my family. That's how much transformation had happened in that 12-month period. So that, of course, changes how I think about disease and health. It changes the way I practice medicine, and it would start me on this new path, and ultimately would change the focus of my clinical research.
Extraordinary. One of the things you discovered was that there's a part of our cells that's required for energy, and by the way, you had terrible energy. That's a classic feature of MS. It's just you're fatigued all the time. You discovered that these little parts of the cells called mitochondria, it's like the energy powerhouse of the cell, were critically important, and they were part of the therapy that you used to treat the mitochondria through diet and other things. So tell us, why are the mitochondria so important in neurodegenerative disease?
Well, the mitochondria are the little bacteria that were engulfed by bigger bacteria about 1.5 billion years ago, and they were very efficient at converting energy from the food we ate into biochemical energy that our cells use. And that would allow cells to become multicellular, to develop organs, tissues, locomotion. It would let us develop brains, hearts, retinas, etc. And the cells that need the most energy, which are our brain cells, our retina, and our heart cells, have like 10,000 mitochondria per cell.
Yeah, and the heart has, I think, 17,000, right?
So it's just so critical. And if your mitochondria are not working very well, then that organ doesn't work very well. And so in the brain, that means that you begin to have problems with fatigue, with pain, with irritability, with cognitive decline. And so, that was actually one of the first things I discovered when I'd gone back to start reading the science, was that mitochondria were at the heart of neurodegeneration for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, Lou Gehrig's. No one was yet writing about that for MS, but I thought, you know what? I bet it's the same, so I'm going to learn everything I can about what I can do to tune up my mitochondria. And so that was the initial interventions that I did, which was a variety of vitamins and supplements to support my mitochondria. Now, when I was first reading about that, Mark, I had this supplement cocktail, creatine, lipoic acid, carnitine, B vitamins, CoQ, and after about 6 months, I thought, it's not helping, and I'm wasting my money, so I quit, and I couldn't get out of bed. I was just completely exhausted, and 3 days later, my spouse comes in and says, honey, I think I ought to take these again. And I took them, and I could get up and function again. And that was very interesting to me. So 2 weeks later, I did the same thing, stopped all my supplements, couldn't function. And 3 days later, I started them, and I could function again. So my conclusion was, you know what? They may not be recovering me, but they're clearly doing something for my fatigue. And that was very energizing, very exciting, because this also taught me that the mitochondria were important, and my neurologist and my primary care doc were not telling me stuff like this, so I could be teaching myself by using PubMed and reading the literature and beginning to do the self-experimentation. So it was a very big discovery.
So great. So how do you take care of your mitochondria? If they're, if they're responsible for contributing to the symptoms and the disease states of the neurodegenerative state, and even things like autism and many other diseases, we may not have the mitochondria be the cause, but it's a big factor that gets damaged when you have these problems. So how do you recover your mitochondria? So
there are three things that I think about. The first one is what's the nutritional need for that mitochondria? So the mitochondria, if you remember from ninth grade biology, there's the little oval with a lot of squiggles in the middle, and that's the cell membrane. So this mitochondria has a lot of cell membrane, which means it has a lot of fat. So you need the right fats, a lot of omega-3s, omega-6 fats to make healthy membranes. You're going to need a lot of B vitamins, and that's essentially the whole B vitamin family to support some of those enzymatic steps. You need a bunch of minerals like zinc, magnesium as cofactors for a lot of those B vitamins, some sulfur amino acids as well, antioxidants. So there's really important nutrition that you need for those mitochondria. The next thing you need to think about is why did the mitochondria begin to not function very well? The most common reason is that they've been poisoned, and it can be poisoned by things like heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic. Pesticides will do that. The insecticides will do that. Some plastics and solvents. So poisoning is the most common thing. And then the third category would be some of the stealth infections, where an infectious particle has sort of hijacked the mitochondria and taken it away from manufacturing energy to manufacturing viral particles. So address those three factors, and you'll go far in restoring that mitochondrial health.
That's so great. The other thing, I think might affect the mitochondria and also the immune system. And, I had a patient with MS many years ago, and, I found I learned the most from just listening to my patients, more than any textbook. And this woman said, when my gut symptoms get worse, my MS gets worse. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I began to sort of work on the gut, and people would get better. And I'm curious what you think about the role of the gut in MS, and also neurodegenerative disease, and how it affects the mitochondria even.
So the evidence about the link between the gut and brain just continues to grow and grow and grow. You can go into PubMed.gov and put in microbiota and MS, and there's more papers coming out. You can put in microbiota and autoimmune conditions, and you'll find that there are more and more papers identifying that you have a different mix of bacteria living in your gut if you've got an autoimmune condition than if you're healthy. As they eat our food and each other's byproducts, they're secreting compounds that cross over into the blood, and then into the blood-brain barrier, and can increase inflammation. They can shift behavior. They can shift our mood, can shift our cognition. So that's clearly having an impact on the brain. Now, in terms of the mitochondria, one thing that they can do is, I believe about 25% of our detoxification capabilities are managed by our gut microbiome. And so if you have a healthy, vigorous microbiome, a health-promoting bacteria, you'll have improved detoxification, and you'll have less poisoning of your mitochondria.
Amazing. You had both an autoimmune and a sort of a neurologic condition, so you sort of had to attack it from both ways. So a lot of the therapies that we use in autoimmune disease in this country are problematic, and you talk a lot about how there's a hidden cost to the therapy, and can you sort of tell us more about why physicians are just stuck on that and not telling the full story that you're telling?
So, there's a really interesting lecture by George Ebers. He's an MS researcher out of the United Kingdom and London. And he reviews that when we were looking at the development of drugs for MS, there was a big conference with the MS researchers. What measures should we monitor to decide that an MS drug is useful? And it's time to the diagnosis of secondary progressive, time to needing a cane, time to needing a walker, time to being bedridden, time to being dead. Because those are the things that really drive cost and suffering.
Yeah.
And in that research meeting, MRI findings, number of relapses, that was like number 19 and number 18 on a list of 20. So they were not thought to be important.
Because they just assume the disease is going to progress.
When you look at the epidemiological literature, number of relapses do not predict time to cane, walker, wheelchair, or death, nor do they predict time to secondary progressive MS. And the number of relapses are very slightly protective. So MRI lesions come and go, and they don't appear to have a very clear relationship to, are you going to become disabled? Are you going to develop secondary progressive? Are you going to need a cane? Are you going to need a wheelchair? Are you going to become bedridden?
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised because what I think likely is going on is the neurodegeneration, which is probably driven by mitochondria. And it's probably driven by nutritional status and nutritional deficiencies. Now, of course, none of that is going to be treated by suppressing the immune cells, because the immune cells are trying their hardest to repair my brain. They are trying their hardest to come in and quiet that inflammation and to begin to remyelinate. So, it's sort of interesting when we looked at our studies, we saw that the people who were the least likely to have improvement in gait were the folks on taking disease-modifying drugs.
So the drugs that are supposed to help you actually didn't help you.
May not be so helpful. You can turn off these acute lesions. Yes, you can do that. And the drugs are very effective at that. But what we don't know is, will they really change the time to wheelchair, the time to bedridden?
Yeah. And you got from bedridden almost to riding your bike 20 miles.
To biking 20 miles.
Remember, these conditions are not a normal part of aging. Taking preventive measures is absolutely key. And even if you're currently dealing with any of these neurodegenerative diseases, I encourage you to dig deeper and to explore your options. In many cases, there's something that can be done to improve your condition.
One of the most exciting things is to see people get better, because I was taught that these people don't get better. And I thought that I would die still studying transgenic mice and cells and culture and things like that. So to see people changing their lives has been very exciting. And for example, we had one person who got much, much better and still at 3.5 years doing very, very well. He had had PET scan proven, ApoE4 positive, repeated neuropsych evaluation, Alzheimer's disease, and has done extremely well. And one of the things he said is, I've allowed myself to talk to my grandchildren about the future once again. He had given up on talking about the future because he knew that the future didn't include him. And so he's gone back to doing that. Another person said that her husband, the nuance in his guitar playing has come back, which was really exciting to hear. Another person was going to commit suicide before first being evaluated and treated, and has done very, very well, and of course did not commit suicide. Actually said to her family member after, did you know that I had Alzheimer's disease? And the family member said, well, of course I did, and it was obvious from your symptoms, but I didn't want to say anything to you about it. Another person said that it has, allowed her to enjoy life again and to get out and do the things that she always enjoyed doing. Another one said that, she went back to playing golf and she was able to remember, what everyone was doing and her own strokes on the course and that thing. So, now a little harder for people to cheat because she actually is seeing who's doing what on the golf course. So just to see the changes. We had another, a young woman who said, my mother is back. My mother is back interacting with the family again. So these sorts of things are really exciting to hear.
If you're like me and you have a parent that has dementia, I think what I've learned is that you really have to be vigilant in your own self-education. Learn what you can about the ways in which diet and lifestyle can modulate brain health, and do your best to lead your parent to a healthier lifestyle. A lifestyle that includes more exercise, better sleep, less stress. Maybe sign them up for a meditation course. Go through their kitchen with them. Tell them, explain to them why certain foods are bad for their brains and why others are really good for their brains. And then at the end of the day, and this might seem counterintuitive, I think at a certain point you have to detach, because stressing yourself out over what your parent is doing can compromise your own brain health. Because again, stress is the enemy of the hippocampus, which is the vulnerable memory processing center of the brain. To use a line that everybody knows, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Ultimately, everybody is going to live the life that they want to live, whether or not they have dementia. So I think it's really important to do your best to get your parent, on a track that promotes brain health, no matter what age. But then also realize that if for whatever reason they don't listen to you, or they don't take as much of a proactive approach as you, that you have to kind of separate yourself, because what I found is that can be really stressful to the caregiver. And again, stress is very damaging, and I'm all about that prevention. So I think we have to do as much as we can to inform our loved ones but then there's a certain level at which we have to detach. Know that we've done our best, we've given the information, we've been teachers to those that matter in our lives, but at the end of the day, you know, people live the way they want to live.
For people watching, they're listening to all this, and they're both probably enraged and enthused about what they can do and what's been happening to them. You know, what would be the things you'd want to say to them to help them become empowered about their brain? What are the take-homes?
I love the word empowered. That is having the knowledge to make change. And let me just say that we live in a world where we are told to live our lives come what may, and when the shoe drops and we are given a diagnosis, we hope there's a magic pill. There is no effective treatment for Alzheimer's, and yet, Dr. Hyman, it is, as you well know, a preventable disease. That's the message. It's a dietary issue. Exercise is fundamentally important for growing new brain cells and staving off Alzheimer's. The diet has to restrict sugars dramatically. I think vitamin D is critically important. So these are things that we're covering on this video. I'm sure that many of your other speakers are going to cover these issues. But the message is embrace this information and make these changes. Don't wait for a cure. Because once the diagnosis happens, it happens very, very quickly. The changes happen quickly, and those changes happen far more quickly than there's going to be any pharmaceutical intervention that's going to help somebody.
It makes me think of that Leonard Cohen song, "There ain't no cure for love." It's like there ain't no cure for diabetes for diabetes or anything, for Alzheimer's in a pill. It's all the things that we can do ourselves to change our biology to affect our brain. In our next episode, we will talk to experts about ADHD and autism. We'll discuss why conventional approaches to these brain disorders are often failing us, and we'll also talk about the root causes of ADHD and autism and what we can do about them. See you there. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I know there's a lot of information to digest, and having the time to properly go through each episode and make notes can be very valuable. If you're finding the information in this docuseries to be helpful, I encourage you to support the Broken Brain mission by choosing to own this docuseries. By owning this series, you also have the opportunity to own the entire, uncut, full-length interviews with over 50 experts. This is all new content that's never been shared before, and quite frankly, we couldn't fit it into the series. But we knew we had to give you the opportunity to own it all at a low price, so that you have all the information available to you when you or your loved ones may need it most. When you purchase this docuseries, you are fully covered with our no questions asked 90-day money-back guarantee. So there's absolutely no risk to you. We've taken that risk on ourselves so that you can just try it out and can decide later whether this is a good fit for you or not.